Good evening. Because the death penalty is an ongoing issue in the United States and in Massachusetts in particular, the Somerville Producers Group and Amnesty International bring you tonight's show, A Matter of Life or Death. First, we will show you a half-hour film entitled The License to Kill, produced by Cadogan Communications Limited of London. Then we will return to the studio, where two guests will debate the essential issues of capital punishment. But now, let's go to the film.
Whereas the above-named prisoner was on the 26th day of August 1971 found guilty and sentenced to death by trial court for the following offenses. 1. Robbery.
At least 12,000 people have been executed by governments around the world since 1980. These include a possible 5,000 in China in 3 months following August 1983, at least 5,000 in Iran, in addition to a great many more secret executions, 1,300 in Iraq, 400 in South Africa. Each country has its own reasons for executing criminals, and these people are all found guilty, according to the laws of their country, of crimes such as robbery, rape, or murder, or other offenses, economic, political, or religious, as, for example, in Iran.
My sister was 28 years old when she was arrested, and a year after that she was executed.
The Baha'i faith began in Iran in 1844, arising out of Islam as Christianity did out of Judaism. Baha'is have always been persecuted, but the Ayatollah Khomeini has begun a new wave of persecution, and the Baha'is are among those who are suffering the most.
My sister was arrested in November 1982, and the Revolutionary Guards came in the house at 12 at night, and she was arrested. After 8 months imprisonment, they asked her and other Baha'is, women, there were 10 women, 7 of them teenagers, they asked them 4 times to recant their faith, and they didn't. So they executed them, they hung them. And secretly, my mother visited my sister the day before the execution. She didn't know anything about it. And the next day she found out, and she rushed into the prison, and she went and saw the body of my sister and all 10 women. And she said that I went in and I saw the body of your sister. I hugged her, I kissed the place of the rope around her neck.
In areas of political instability, such as here in South Korea, the legal system is often used as a way of suppressing opponents. A prominent leader of the Korean political opposition was Kim Dae-jung. In 1980, he was arrested and sentenced to death. Soon after his arrest, he was visited in prison by a member of the military government.
He proposed me 2 choices. One was to be cooperative with them. So he told me, if you are cooperative with us, we can save your life, and we can guarantee everything except becoming president. That means, you know, they would allow me to become a prime minister or, a National Assembly speaker, and any, luxurious life, but only except president. And he also told me, otherwise, you would be surely killed. He came to see me 3 times, but every time I refused. So finally he told me, okay, you would be killed. Don't, put any hope to trial. That was, his final remark. And after then, I was put, trial. But that's only, showcase.
In March 1983, a law was passed in the once Portuguese colony of Mozambique, which introduced the death penalty for economic crimes, smuggling or trading on the black market. Even people arrested for such offenses before the law was introduced could be sentenced to death. This Indian businessman's friend suffered exactly that.
Well, what happened actually was there was this Saturday which we call Black Saturday. I mean, the people call it Black Saturday because on this Saturday there were, let's say, about 17 arrests, out of which were 14 Indians, let's say, 14 Indians, yes. They didn't give any they didn't give anything in writing or anything like that. Just when people used to, when the person who was trying to, let's say, who was his wife, used to go there, and when they asked her, they say, well, he's in for economic crimes because he used to export things out illegally and he used to import things in illegally. He didn't have any legal defense, no. The trial took place, let's say, 11 people were heard in 45 minutes, and that was it.
Out of 176 countries in the world, there are only 26 who have abolished capital punishment. The death penalty has been used in over 60 of the remainder, including 38 of the 50 United States.
I was arrested for the rape murder of a 6 to 8-year-old elderly white woman in Fort Myers. On November 5th, 1973, I was tried April 74 and received a death sentence.
More than 1,350 people in America wait on death row for the result of appeals against their sentence of death. In the United States, the death penalty was suspended for a period of nearly 10 years, but has recently been reintroduced. The crime is invariably murder, and the death sentences only imposed for what are judged to be the worst cases.
Rick was our oldest child. He was 19 and a freshman in college, working part-time at a fast food restaurant in Virginia. And the classic case, someone hid in the bathroom, came out after they closed, robbed. What then became very untypical was he forced the 5 employees into a walk-in freezer, and instead of leaving at that point, opened fire on them. He shot each of them at least 3 times. We know for a fact that he stood and reloaded twice and kept firing. Apparently, at all costs, he wanted no witnesses. One woman did survive, but the other 4 employees were killed instantly, including our son. The feelings of vengeance are strong and immediate. I was hurt. I wanted to reach out so badly and hurt someone. When there was an arrest made, I mean, long before the trial, the man is supposedly presumed innocent. I could have strangled him. I wanted to hurt him the way he had hurt me. Fortunately, we live in a society where we're not allowed to do that, where time separates us, where the system separates us. But I had to understand that. I had to come to terms with the fact that, yes, he hurt me. He caused this. But no matter how much I hurt him, I've got to put him out of my life because he's not important. What was important in my life was my son. And somehow I have to learn to live without my son. And I can't do it by hating someone. There is no way that they can give me back my son by executing someone else. And in fact, had the system executed his killer, I think what they would have been saying to me is, all right, here, you lost a life, we've taken another life, we're even. This isn't true. 2 wrongs don't make a right, and by executing the man that killed my son, it doesn't make anything right. I still have to grieve. I still have to work through my pain and my sorrow, and I still have to incorporate my son's death into my life. And for society to say, your grief should be over because we've executed someone, is really nonsense.
I don't think anybody can say that taking the life of anybody else is ever going to improve society. I think that it may at least turn around and say that capital punishment does, in fact, deter other people from committing certain types of crimes. And if, in fact, that will protect society, then yes, I think that would improve society that way. As to vengeance being an appropriate type of response by the state, yes, I think that's an appropriate type of response by the state. It's in our system today, and I don't think there's anything wrong with it. It's always been there.
I think the safest platform on which I will speak from is that if a person is accused and found guilty of a violent crime, where there are no other side issues such as domestic emotion or whatever it may be, if once they're found guilty at that level, then it's a matter of a life for a life. Stop. And there's no doubt about it, certainly as far as police officers are concerned, and I believe the majority of people in this country, as far as they're concerned, they recognize that there is a deterrent factor in capital punishment. And the statistics, the vociferous minorities who fight against it, I believe are being misled.
There are studies available now which show that, on the contrary, the availability of the death penalty has a counter-deterrent effect. That is to say that it provides an incentive to marginally pathological people who are deplorably abundant in every complex society, including this one, for whom the spectacle of an execution is an incentive to commit further violent acts, because they learned from the state that if you have a quarrel with a human being, it may be the appropriate thing to do, kill that person. After all, when a state is in the business of killing people because it has an ultimate quarrel with somebody, because on the allegation or the conviction for a crime, then the society learns that it is not the killing of a human being in and of itself that's so outrageous, but that if the right people do the killing and have a good enough reason for killing, then killing is perfectly all right. That is what an execution teaches.
Executing people in public is a way for a particular society to emphasize the deterrent idea. In the United States of America, the public element has been ritualized into the institution of witnessing, where representatives of the public and the press see the sentence carried out and witness it on behalf of the rest of the country. The process of law which has to be gone through in the United States is long, rigorous, and painstaking, with the appeal process lasting for as long as 10 years or more. David Bruck spends most of his time working on appeals for men on death row.
It very often, and with increasing frequency, we're beginning to see now, have been seeing over the last 10 years, that it's not the worst cases that get the death penalty. One of the most important indicators of whether a given murderer goes to death row into the electric chair or the gas chamber, or whether they receive a prison sentence, appears to be the race of the victim. As a practical matter, it's not true to say that murder is a capital crime in the United States. The truth is that the murder of a white victim is a capital crime. The murder of a non-white victim, with very few exceptions, is not a capital crime. It does not lead to the death penalty.
Britain has almost completely abolished the death penalty, but the British law lords, sitting as the Privy Council, are still the last court of appeal for former colonial countries which punish many offences by death.
The trials in these countries which retain the death penalty are generally fair, according to English law, and that's the difficulty for me, trying to appeal against them in a far-off country on technical points of law. If there has been no technical misdirection in the judge's summing up, then the chance of appeal is slim. However, the way the trial is conducted is not always satisfactory in ways that you can't appeal against. For example, in some countries where the death penalty exists, there is no full legal aid to provide very good counsel to defend, and one often finds very young barristers being drafted in to do these most serious cases because they're the only ones who will accept the low payment. One has that, still sees that in South Africa, for example, where the youngest members of the bar are often found defending the most desperate cases. It does concern me that the sort of people who are dying by a judicial decision or a judicial process in these countries are, for the most part, people who are certainly very poor, certainly have acted as a result of some sort of spur-of-the-moment action. The sort of action which isn't deterred. They don't think of the consequences. I mean, for heaven's sake, countries like Jamaica and Trinidad and Singapore have had automatic application of the death penalty for murder, and that for years and years, and it hasn't made any difference to the murder rate.
Each country, looking around the world at the other countries, no doubt feels that the reasons that it puts people to death are uniquely good reasons, whether it be warring against Islam or in Iran, inciting subversion and the danger of race war in South Africa, economic crimes in the Soviet Union, or aggravated murder in the United States. What the death penalty has in common in all of those countries, including this one, is that it involves reading a person out of the human race, denying that they are even human beings. And that is why the death penalty is related to race in the United States. It is easier to read someone out of the human race if we don't fully regard them as human to begin with. And that, after all, is what racism is. We are slower to condemn somebody to death if they look like us, talk like us, seem like us.
My all-white jury retired to deliberate after those arguments, and that they returned and unanimously recommended life imprisonment. But my trial judge stated that he simply could not accept the jury's recommendation, and so he sentenced me to death. But going deeper into the racial aspects of it is that during the year of '72, when the United States Supreme Court threw out the death penalty, my trial judge, he went home, he got a rope, he came back, he called a news conference, and he made a hangman's noose, and he threw it across the limb on a courthouse lawn. And he stated that, as far as he was concerned, that he wished they would do it the way they did it the old days. And of course, we know the old days consisted of blacks being dragged down the streets by lynch mobs or what have you. And so less than a year later, I'm before this man.
The danger of executing an innocent person is perhaps the most practical argument put forward by abolitionists. In Japan, 2 people have recently been released after spending more than 30 years under sentence of death for crimes they did not commit. In Britain, Timothy Evans was executed in 1952, and a year later he was acknowledged to have been innocent.
It doesn't matter what answer I give to responding to the question of mistakes. It's always going to be open to further questions. But in this country, we've always believed that the person is innocent until proven guilty. And one has to rely on the judgment of the courts in that regard. Now, I know the fallback of that, of course, is that somebody will say, yes, but within all the other crimes, then you can make some compensation. The person is not dead. And that is true, and this is why I find it very difficult to argue against that particularly emotive argument. It's a real argument, but it is also a emotive argument. But I think if you live by the principles of justice, then you've got to accept the principles of justice irrespective of when they go wrong. Fortunately, it's not doesn't happen very often. Not that that's much consolation to the person who's been hung, I agree. But it's the principles of justice, I believe, must be maintained.
So long as the death penalty is available and so long as executions are carried out, it is a rational certainty that occasionally the state will execute an innocent person. The criminal justice system, after all, is organized by human beings who are fallible and administered by fallible human beings and makes mistakes all the time. Normally on matters less severe than questions of life or death, but so long as executions will take place, occasionally innocent people will be sentenced to death and some of them will be executed. There are two men named Pitts and Lee, two young men who were arrested in Florida and charged with a capital offense and ultimately sentenced to death, and spent something on the order of 12 years on death row in Florida before it was finally determined that they were literally innocent, were nowhere near the scene of the crime, that someone else who was ultimately apprehended had committed it, and were then eventually released by the governor and would long since have been executed but for a temporary moratorium at that time on executions in the state of Florida.
People are executed all over the world under less stringent judicial systems.
I think she knew what is going to happen to her, because, as again the friend wrote me that in one of the questionings that they were asking her, she burst into cries. They were forcing her to recount her faith, and he burst into cries, and she said that, why are you forcing me? Because this is in my heart. You can't bring it out. I believe in Baha'u'llah. I am a Baha'i. I can't deny those. I can't recount these. So whatever you want to do, do to me. She was very brave, very brave.
He didn't die at the first shot. I think there were 6 to every person. There were 6 soldiers to every person. So there were six persons. There were 6 soldiers to every person, and they shot. But they say he didn't die at this first shot. And he was still screaming because he didn't get it in the head. He was still screaming. This is an actual eyewitness describing it, because they described it to me and to a lot of persons there. They say he didn't die, and then there was this commander, the commander of the soldiers, who went there and put a pistol right to the head and shot him.
The line between abolition and retention is a thin one. At least one country has abolished the death penalty each year since 1979, including France in 1982. However, the United States recently resumed executions, and Britain debated and defeated the reintroduction of capital punishment in 1983. Lady Jane Ewart-Biggs is a member of the British House of Lords. Her husband, the British ambassador to the Irish Republic, was blown up by the IRA. She remains a strong opponent of the death penalty and spoke to Robert Badinter, Minister of Justice in France.
I mean, your view is that for a free country, they have to take a choice. It's a moral choice.
Definitely.
And you would say that in America, they have confused this choice.
Yes, when you come to death penalty, you have to be very clear. Either you make the choice, how would I say, in the Khomeini's way. You have people killed, it becomes a major political weapon, and it's a symbol of power and your civilization. The state just kill. The individual must die if the state, for religion or ideological reasons, decides so. The individual life has no value as such when the time comes for the state to decide that it should not.
So it's a political instrument.
Yes, or religious instrument. But when you have, as we do in our democracy, a totally opposed view, where everything starts from the respect of the individual, then you cannot allow the life of the individual being taken away by decision of the state. But you cannot play both parts. You cannot have, as the Americans unfortunately have now, at the same time, a democracy based on the respect of the individual and death penalty, with the consequences that they have death penalty, people in the death row, they execute and then they don't execute, and the whole system gets morally corrupted.
Yes, exactly.
You have to make the choice. It's abolition or communist way.
Amnesty has taken an absolutist position against the death penalty, not only for people we usually work for, those who are imprisoned because of their opinions, but in all cases, because we found out that you cannot make a distinction when it comes to the right to life between a category of prisoners in comparison to another category. We feel that this is a moral question, that the society itself should not kill its own citizens for whatever reason. By having a positive position there, it will, the society, the government, the authorities, will demonstrate to the members of the society, the people, that violence and especially killing is not acceptable under any circumstances.
In this instance, our state in Maryland has come to the conclusion that there is benefit to the state to take under certain limited circumstances another person's life if it may in fact save the life of somebody else. And I think morally speaking, they're correct.
What the United States does is that it is quick to mention that 30 executions happened in China, that the Ayatollah Khomeini, that he has committed so many horrendous crimes. But whereas here in America, we seem to think it's different, simply because we allow our citizens what we call due process. And then due process means a person goes to court, you know, he has the right to appeal, and then like 6 years, 10 years later, then the United States execute you, and that makes it right according to his own evaluation.
I have always felt that the death penalty was both inhuman and uncivilized. When my son was murdered, I had to, of course, re-examine this because of my rage and my anger and my hatred at the person who had done this to them. I thought possibly I was wrong. Maybe there were instances when someone should be put to death for something that they have done. And then I decided that I had been right, that I don't want my life focused on hatred. I want it, in fact, to focus on love. And there's no way that you can do that and fight for a death penalty for someone, or even condone the death penalty.
Welcome back to the studio. My name is Parrish Dobson. I work for the Somerville Producers Group, and I will be your host tonight for a debate on the death penalty. The film you have just seen, The License to Kill, largely highlighted the arguments against using execution in either political or criminal cases. And indeed, as the film pointed out, most European nations have struck down the use of capital punishment. In the United States, however, the practice of capital punishment is, if anything, on the rise. Let me give you a brief recent history. In 1972, the Supreme Court, in the case called Furman versus Georgia, effectively deemed all capital punishment laws unconstitutional. Because only a tiny percent of those convicted for capital crimes were actually executed, the justices ruled that the laws were unequal, if not arbitrary, in application and therefore inconsistent with the Constitution. But in subsequent years, 38 states have passed new capital punishment laws, each designed to satisfy the Supreme Court's objections in 1972. In most states, for example, sentencing now occurs in separate hearings after the guilt has been determined. Currently, Massachusetts does not have death penalty legislation, but two referenda, one in 1980 and another in 1982, indicate wide public support for the reinstatement of capital punishment. Thus, in 1982, a bill reinstituting the death penalty was passed in the legislature. This bill, however, was struck down by the Supreme Judicial Court because it was ruled unconstitutional. The new legislation, presumably free of legal flaws of the first, is now being drafted in the state legislature. That's the background. Now to the issues. With us tonight are arguing in favor of capital punishment Dennis Curran, an attorney with Demento and Sullivan. Mr. Curran has served as legal counsel to Governor King for 4 years. Welcome. Arguing against the death penalty is Dr. Jonathan Weisbach, medical director of HMO Rhode Island and former chairman of the Physicians Against the Death Penalty. Welcome. To give a background on exactly how we will handle our debate, each person will have 2 minutes to respond to the question posed. After that, each will have 30 seconds to rebut the other's arguments. So let's get started. I will start with you, Dr. Weisbach. Okay. The death penalty is frequently cited as a deterrent to capital crime. Do you agree or disagree with with this statement, and what is the evidence?
I would disagree with that statement, and I think, excuse me, that the evidence is very clear, it's very clear that there is no evidence to indicate any deterrent effect whatsoever with capital punishment as a preventive or as a preventive against murder. A large number of studies have been done over the course of many, many years. I think the most recent and one of the most significant was published by Bowers and Pierce in 1982, in which they looked at the deaths from the executions in New York from 1900, and in fact found that not only was there no deterrent to as a result of capital punishment, but in fact the murder rate in the state of New York seemed to go up following each execution. So that my feeling is, and I think there is other evidence to indicate, that in fact violence begets violence, and you have in fact after executions a higher murder rate rather than a lower rate.
Thank you.
The response simply is that many of those studies that are referred to by my brother were conducted by people who were very sympathetic to abolishing capital punishment. And it's very much like letting the fox in with the chicken. Ultimately, the studies are going to be biased in the favor of the manner in which the people who conducted those studies are predisposed. What studies are reliable, what studies aren't, I don't know. There are studies on either side, I can say that. Furtherance, we have to look at the overall scheme of our criminal justice system. It's not simply and solely deterrence that capital punishment is based upon. It's to some extent an element of retribution. To some extent it's an element of societal protection. And all of these purposes behind capital punishment have to be examined. And I don't think we should rely solely on deterrence. Although personally I do believe that it deters. Professor Isaac Ehrlich from the University of Chicago believes in his study, and with the true integrity of a scholar, he's personally opposed on moral grounds, by the way, capital punishment. But his study has revealed that for every execution, 8 would-be murderers are deterred.
Would you like to respond? 30 seconds.
Well, it's interesting that Mr. Curran refers to the Ehrlich study, which has been refuted by every investigator who's ever looked at it, including the Supreme Court. And if I may quote Chief Justice Berger, who I understand is not, who is probably a pro-death penalty individual, he has said in one of the recent cases that there is no evidence whatsoever to indicate that the death penalty is a deterrent to murder or other capital crimes.
Well, yet he still supports capital punishment, so I'm not dissuaded by your argument.
I'm just telling you what he said. He said that there is no evidence to indicate that is a deterrent. He may support it for other reasons, but his argument is that it doesn't deter.
What are his
murder.
arguments in favor of capital punishment? Let's
Your
get to
30
those.
seconds then, Mr. Kern.
Let's get to the arguments that that Chief Justice Berger would support capital punishment, and those are, as I said before, the protection of society. You know, I think we underlook, with all these sociological studies and all this statistical data, the basic element that we're talking about, and that is that society has a right to protect itself from the most cold-blooded and vicious murderer. Okay. I'm not talking about heat of passion killing, but the cold-blooded vicious killer.
Okay, thank you very much. Now on to our second question. You'll have time, by the way, to recoup all of these questions in your final statements. Second question, only 3% of all convicted murderers are sentenced to death. This raises the question about who is actually receiving the death penalty and why. Does race or socioeconomic status of the victim or the perpetrator of the crime affect the likelihood that the death penalty will be applied? Mr. Curran.
I think it probably did, and I would have to agree with that statement. Race certainly was an element of many of those executions that were carried out in the earlier part of the century and in some of the southern states. What is the case in Massachusetts? No one can say for the last several years, certainly, because no one has been executed since 1949. But let's look at the numbers before 1949. There were 27 people executed from 1925 to 1949. 25 of those 27 people were white, 2 were black. Is that conclusive evidence? You know, I wouldn't say that it is. I can tell you that the capital punishment law that was drafted, and I drafted it, was colorblind. It is to be colorblind in application. The Supreme Judicial Court has the right to review every case and review and see if there was any discriminatory application. And if it was, they will overturn those sentences. I don't think that we should view this as a racial issue, because first and foremost, black people, white people alike are victims of capital crimes. It doesn't matter whether the victim is black or white, they're still dead. And I think black people or members of racial and ethnic minorities are entitled to the full measure of protection of the law. And we're denying them that protection by saying you can't have capital punishment.
Thank you. Dr. Wiseman.
Well, there are two. I would argue that capital punishment is exacted upon 2 classes in society. The minority class, those who are by whatever racial group, whether it's blacks in the South or Irish in the 19th century in Massachusetts or Italians in the first half of this century, those groups that are the underclass, if you will, are usually the ones that end up being executed. I think there's ample evidence to indicate that of all the common issues with regard to those who are executed, invariably they are poor, they are destitute, they are without funds. As a matter of fact, when one of these cases was being argued, William Douglas on the Supreme Court indicated that he had to search long and hard to find anyone who came from the affluent class in society. And as a matter of fact, I don't think one can find anyone who has any affluence as someone who has been subject to the death penalty. It is clear that prior to 1970, those who were on death row and those who were executed were members primarily black and poverty-stricken. Since the reinstitution in 1976 or whenever, 77, of capital punishment in this country, it isn't that clear. There have only been about 48 or 49 executions, and many of those in the beginning were white. But if you look at death row currently, well over 40% are black. And they are in the South, they are poor, and the numbers of individuals on death row far exceed the black population in any of the constituencies in which they're held. The other point is that primarily the people who are being sentenced or sentenced to death are those who have killed white individuals. If you kill a black man in our society or a black woman, the chances are you will not be sentenced to death.
Thank you.
This aspect of this whole debate rankles me, because when I was a prosecutor way back when, 10 years ago in Suffolk County, we saw the most atrocious murders perpetrated upon black people. You know, it wasn't too long ago that there were a string of black women who were murdered viciously and dropped in trash barrels along, like common trash along city streets, and that disturbs me. All you have to do is see those photographs once, and for me, the argument as to whether it's racial in application is totally irrelevant.
Thank you. 30 seconds, Dr. Weisbach.
Well, no one's arguing that violence and horrors are perpetrated on all members of society. That's very clear. What we're arguing is that the death penalty does not prevent that, and because it seems to be arbitrarily carried out, or at least exploited, it is primarily exploited upon or carried out upon those who are minorities and those who are poor.
Thank you. Our next question. Chief among the arguments against the death penalty is the fear that an innocent person may be executed. In your view, is this a valid concern? Will you begin, Dr. Weisbach?
Absolutely. I think the reason why those of us who are against the death penalty the primary reason is that any innocent individual may in fact find himself subjected to a charge of being a murderer and then found guilty of that crime and executed, and then subsequently it'd be learned that the case was in error. And I think the most dramatic case in this century, and certainly in Massachusetts, is the Sacco and Vanzetti case, where I just heard today that there's more evidence that has come out, even after many studies that were done during that period. There's evidence that has come out that was new evidence from the prosecutor's office, which indicated that certain bits of evidence was obscured, and that that they clearly were innocent. And I think that's the reason why Governor Dukakis, back in the late 70s, exonerated them.
The reason Governor Dukakis exonerated them was...
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
Dr.
I'm sorry.
I thought I had 2 minutes. Will you give me my time?
Yes.
Sure.
There have been, in very recent days, many cases of individuals who were found guilty of a capital crime, sentenced at Walpole to die in the electric chair, and for one reason or another were not executed. One individual who was, within 10 minutes of his execution, was given a pardon, or given, the sentence was reprieved, and 15 years later it was found that he had an unfair trial and was exonerated from the crime. And so that happens all the time. It doesn't happen in hundreds of cases, but there is data to indicate that at least 4 or 5 times a year, individuals are sentenced to death for crimes that they did not commit, and and would, in fact, some of them will end up being executed if they are not reprieved subsequently.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Kern.
Let me correct a misimpression. First of all, the reason why Sacco and Vanzetti were pardoned in 1978 was because the governor at that time was in the midst of a very spirited political campaign, and everyone who knew what was going on realized that pardon was effectuated as a political ploy to pander to one constituent group, that is the Italians. He needed the Italian vote that year, and that's the reason why it was done in an election year. I'm not saying Sacco and Vanzetti were not unjustly convicted, because in my personal opinion, I happened to do a little work on this in college, in my personal opinion, they were unjustly convicted. In my personal opinion also, they were guilty. They did not get a fair trial, but that was the standards of a criminal justice system in 1927. They were convicted by a Yankee judge, and they were the victims of discrimination in those days. That was long before you or I, or hopefully you, were born. Those sort of circumstances just aren't present in the present political criminal justice system. What is the possibility that someone who is innocent can be convicted unfairly? I think it's remote to the point of statistical insignificance. Now, am I saying the system of criminal justice is perfect? No, of course it's not perfect. Nothing in this world, if you want to be realistic about life, I've found very little things in my life, or I'm sure others who are listening to us today or tonight, that is perfect. But we can design or attempt to design the fairest and the most impartial system of justice. And we have to live with that system of justice. Why? Because ultimately, this system is a system designed to protect us from the transgressions of others who are more violent and uncontrollable.
Okay. Rebuttal.
Well, very quickly, I find it interesting that the lawyer for Governor King, who used the death penalty issue as his primary reason to be reelected in the Democratic primary, would charge Governor Dukakis as using the exoneration of Sacklin Vanzetti as a political issue. That's rather the pot calling the kettle black. But be that as it may, the death penalty has clearly been used for political reasons across time. The point, I think, of significance is that the death penalty is clearly not a deterrent, or does it in any way protect society against violent crimes.
Thank you. Rebuttal.
Well, other than what I've already said, I think I'll pass on that. Obviously, I come from a certain political predisposition, and I think, it's a free country. I can say what I believe about a particular governor's political motives in pardoning Sacklin Vanzetti. That doesn't escape the fact that I have yet to hear my colleague, other than some oblique references to Southern justice perhaps 20 years ago, point to a Massachusetts resident who's been unfairly convicted and executed in recent American history.
Okay, on to our next question. Capital punishment, like abortion, is often viewed as ultimately a moral issue, each side defining morality in very different terms. What is the moral justification for your position? Would you begin, Mr. Curry?
Well, I think it's society's expression of outrage at particularly repugnant conduct. And I think society has a right to be repelled and has a right to protect itself. It's not so much different. If a nation has been declared war upon, or such as acts of aggression in World War II, everybody assumed that America had the right to go to war against these warring nations. And we had a right to protect ourselves as a nation. So too, we have a right to protect ourselves as a society. And without that, what I believe to be a valuable tool to protect ourselves in the most egregious of cases, and I'm not saying it's carte blanche across the board, let's execute all the murderers, but for the Sammy White Bowlerdrome, where a fellow had four young men kneel on the ground and took a shotgun to their head and cold-bloodedly execute, for the trash bag murders of black women in Roxbury, for the burning of innocent people. These things happen. All you have to do is watch Hill Street Blues, and believe me, that is a reflection of what is going on out there. And let's not delude ourselves that it's any different. So those sort of expressions require society's appropriate response in measured terms.
Thank you. Dr. Weisbuck.
Well, the question, I gather, was what is the moral reason for my position? And I think one could simply cite the Old and the New Testament and the human condition of respecting other men's rights and other men's liberty, and that the idea that thou shalt not kill seems to be a primary basis for the morality against the death penalty. If there were any reason at all, any evidence at all to indicate that, quote-unquote, society is protected, as my colleague here would indicate, then one might consider the death penalty as a reasonable judicial alternative to the other alternatives that exist. However, since there is no evidence that it is a deterrent, then I asked, how does the death penalty protect society against the killing of the people in the Sammy White Ballroom or any of the other violent crimes? How do you protect society against a Manson who is clearly crazy, or against a son of Sam who is, not going to stop doing what he's doing simply because there's a law in the book? There was a law in the book in New York when he was carrying out his killings. Murder is not a rational event that can be protected against by a social device such as the possibility that maybe I will be executed if I go out and murder. Usually it's a crime of passion. Often it's carried out by someone who is insane or at least mentally deranged. And in the cases where it is egregious of the types that have been mentioned, Those are often done at a moment of passion by the individual for whatever reasons is often not determined. And that is not going to be prevented, or is not going to, society is not going to be prevented against those things. In the states where death penalties exist, the rate of murder is higher than it is, say, in Massachusetts, where we do not have a death penalty and where the rate of murder is only 4 per 100,000.
Thank you. We have to stop.
Rebuttal. We must be living in a different state from one another, because I see a fellow like Anthony Jackson, who murdered 8 young women in Somerville and in Cambridge a decade ago or so, one after the other, after the other, after the other, and so on and so on. Now that fellow knew full well what he was doing. He knows full well what he's doing now. He's one of the premier jailhouse lawyers down in Walpole. I mean, the fellow is a smart cookie. He just happens to be a murderer. That's his way.
Thank you. 30 seconds, Dr. Weiss.
And does that justify society? Does taking a life is it justifiable to take a life just because someone else has taken a life? If you believe in that arcane notion, then you should be living 4,000 years before Christ. Today we have a different morality. Today the morality is the morality under which the Constitution was written, which I think is the individual rights and individual freedoms, and believing in human beings as something important, and not to degrade all of us by killing, public execution. What a horror.
Thank you. In the time remaining, I would like to ask each of you an individual question and give you 1 minute to respond. Dr. Weisbach, you first. What would be your response to a convicted murderer who, after years serving out his life sentence, requests his own execution?
An individual who requests his own execution?
As in the case of Gary Gilmore.
Well, yeah, I don't believe in killing under any circumstance. If a man wants to commit suicide, then I'm against that. As a physician, I view that as somewhat aberrant behavior, and I would take whatever action or whatever is appropriate in the context of the situation to prevent an individual's committing suicide. Now, you can't always prevent someone from killing themselves, and that's unfortunately very obvious in every walk of life. However, it seems to me that if an individual does make that expression, as did a woman in California just recently who was unable to move, I can't remember the exact case, but she had some multiple sclerosis or some other disease, and she was unable to move, and she requested the court to allow her to go into a nursing home or to a hospital and die. She was denied that request. She then subsequently said that she was glad that it was denied. I don't think one would give a Gary Gilmore the right to have himself executed. I think you would try to counsel him and find out what were the reasons.
Thank you. Mr. Curran, the United States and Turkey are the only nations among the Western allies to maintain and to enact capital punishment legislation. Why, if other advanced industrial democracies have rid themselves of this form of legislation, do we need it here in America?
We need it to protect ourselves from a spiraling crime rate and a brutalization of society that is one-to-one causally related with our failure to control and punish and protect society. Now, what do I mean by that? In Britain, I mean, you're comparing apples and oranges. In Britain, the Bobbies don't even wear guns, although maybe they may have gone to them in the last 2 years. In recent history, they haven't used guns. If you were to disarm the police force in this country, the criminals would have a heyday. You know, it's simply the fact that, let's bring it back to Massachusetts instead of talking about Iran and Turkey. We have had in this state a 170% increase in our murder rate. 170% increase since 1960, in the last 2.5 decades. It's obvious to those of us, those who are on the front lines in the war on crime, so to speak, that society needs a tool to protect itself, and this is the tool.
Thank you, gentlemen. We now would like each of you to take 2 minutes to sum up the arguments that we've touched on and the entire issue as you see it. Would you care to begin, Dr. Weisbach?
Yeah, thank you. Let me start by saying that the grim picture that my colleague, Mr. Curran, presents about a rising death rate, I think is not quite consistent with the facts as I see them. I have in front of me that I'm looking at some notes that I put down with regard to the death rate, the murder rate in Massachusetts from 1970. That's 15 years. And it started in 1970 at 3.5 murders per 100,000 population. And it changed very little during the 70s. The highest was 4.4 in 1974. Then it dropped again to 3.7 and 3.1, 3.6. Over the last 4 years, since 1980, or 5 years, it was 4.1, 3.6, 3.8, 3.5, and 3.6, almost unvarying. That is in the face of a national murder rate across the country of almost 3 times that figure, around 9 to 10 per 100,000. We are not subjected to a vast murder rate in this society, quite the reverse. The crime rate, which Mr. Curran refers to, which crime in the street, holdups, petty larceny, and so on, that's a different story. But that is not something for which he is arguing that capital punishment would protect society against. We have, I think, reasonably good laws and a judicial system that is capable of apprehending criminals of every kind and finding them guilty if they are in fact guilty and sentencing them to an appropriate length of stay in the prison system. An individual who carries out a heinous murder and is sentenced to life imprisonment has been, that is as an effective an approach to prevent crime as anything else. Anyone who has been in the prison system, as I have as the director of correctional services in the mid-70s, knows that being in Walpole or Norfolk for even a few days is no pleasure. And life imprisonment for murders is a perfectly legitimate approach and is certainly an adequate deterrent and is completely humane and is not violent or degrading as capital punishment is.
Thank you. Mr. Curran, excuse me.
My colleague appears satisfied with our present system of criminal justice. If I look into the camera and I ask the people out there tonight, if you are satisfied, keep things the way they are. Certainly vote against capital punishment or any tough-on crime measures. But I hesitate to think that most people, reasonable people, fear for themselves late at night if they walk down to the store 24 and have to confront a gang of young toughs, or are stranded along the highway late at night at the mercy of some of these people who come along and simply prey upon others. I don't think things are as hunky-dory as my colleague would have you believe. That's why 4 out of every 5 people oppose the efforts of people like my colleague to rid us of capital punishment, and they support the reinstitution of capital punishment because they see it as a tool to protect ourselves from certain kinds of murder. You know, there are 2 reasons for capital punishment.
But it doesn't work.
No,
Excuse me, Dr. Weisbach, continue.
I didn't observe the rules when you were talking, so I'd ask the same of you. I think that we have to look at a common sense approach to the whole problem. And that is, you know, I think if most people believe, as I think they do, that if punishment deters a crime, you know, if somebody knows they're going to be punished, they're not going to commit the crime. Similarly, capital punishment must deter capital crimes. And so, too, I think capital punishment is a matter of justice and human dignity. We have to protect the innocent. We have to prevent the Anthony Jacksons of the world from preventing the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and 10th murders.
Thank you both very, very much. That concludes our debate for this evening. For those viewers who would be interested in contacting Dennis Curran in support of legislation for the death penalty, he can be reached through Demento and Sullivan, 100 State Street, Boston, Massachusetts. The phone number is 523-5253. For those interested in lending their energies in opposition to the death penalty, contact Amnesty International at 547-9295 or the Massachusetts Citizens Against the Death Penalty at 138 Tremont Street, Boston, 542-6044. Thank you. That concludes our show, brought to you by the Somerville Producers Group and Amnesty International.
Sweet mother, I never forget. the suffer where you suffer for me, yeah. When I dey cry, my mother go carry me. She go say, my pikin, wetin you dey cry, yeah, yeah. Stop, 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 make you no cry again. Oh, my mother, oh, sorry. If I don't sleep, my mother no go sleep. If I don't talk,